Gripped by protests and without a government, Lebanon is no stranger to political crisis. Its leaders are picked from the country's biggest religious communities in a unique system known as confessionalism. So, is it time for a new approach? Welcome to Roundtable. Hello there, I'm Shiulie Ghosh. For weeks, Lebanon has seen massive anti-government protests fueled by an economic crisis and failing public services. The anger has cut across sectarian lines, and that's significant in a country where political power is divided between religious groups. Now people are demanding a new independent government and a move away from the ruling elite.
Lebanon has been witnessing some of its biggest demonstrations in over a decade. The economy is in crisis, and hundreds of thousands of people have protested at the way the government has handled it. Lebanon is struggling with some of the highest debt levels in the world, and many citizens say they are lacking basic public services. The government has also been accused of corruption. Prime Minister Saad Hariri stepped down, but protesters say it's not just about the economy. They argue that the current system of government is sectarian, divisive and out of date. Lebanon's system assigns the post of Prime Minister to a Sunni Muslim, the President is a Maronite Christian, and the Speaker of Parliament is a Shia Muslim. The system aims to ensure political representation for the country's different sects. Christians are allocated 64 seats, while Muslims and Druze get the other 64. These numbers are based on population, not the current population, but a census from 1938. Critics say politicians gain power through their sectarian connections rather than ability. Government officials argue that Lebanon's political system reflects the religious structure of society and has provided stability. So is a non-sectarian government in Lebanon the answer?
Let me introduce today's guests to you. Joining us from Beirut, Ghinwa Obeid, senior reporter at the Daily Star Lebanon. Nizar Hassan, political activist and co-host of the Lebanese Politics podcast. Here in the studio, we have Sophie Chamas, senior teaching fellow at the Centre for Gender Studies at SOAS, University of London. She's also an anthropologist of social movements focused on Lebanon. And Hicham Safieddine, lecturer in history of the modern Middle East at King's College. Good to have all of you with us. Let's start in Beirut. Ghinwa, I know that you have covered these protests extensively. How do they differ from protests that Lebanon has seen before, and what are protesters asking for?
So first of all, what differentiates the protests that we've seen is, I think the main thing is that they're cross-sectarian. And the second part is that they include people from different areas and from different socioeconomic backgrounds. Also, notably, is that these protests, they don't have, if you want, a certain group that has been spearheading them on the ground. So it's truly people who have demands, who have been facing tough living conditions, that went to the streets in order to call for a better living conditions. And what we've seen last week in terms of having students, school and university students actually heading to the ground and protesting, saying that they don't want to attend classes, rather what they want is, they said that it's a national duty for them to be on the ground and to basically say that, no, we're here, we also have certain demands, and that basically we don't want to leave Lebanon, we want to build a future in our country. And so this is, I think, these are certain factors that kind of differentiate the protests that we've seen over the past couple of days compared to what we've seen previously.
Okay, Nizar, tell me about your involvement, and do you agree that these are protests which are cutting across all backgrounds and all sectarian divides?
First of all, I'm active with a group called LiHaqqi, which is my right in Arabic. And it's the group that called for the first protests on October 17 against the new taxes. And we've been involved in organizing in certain areas and supporting different groups organizing as well. In terms of what this movement represents, of course, it's cross-sectarian. And the key thing about it, as Ghinwa was saying, is that it's very decentralized. It's based on genuine grassroots involvement of people across Lebanon. And people are not going to Beirut to protest this time. They are protesting in their own areas, blocking their own roads and their own squares, villages and towns. And this is what gives it a true kind of popular nature in terms of representing the population and enforcing this idea that it's a people uprising, it's the people's uprising against the ruling class rather
But
than
Nizar, the government has
mobilized.
tried to bring in measures to tackle the economic crisis. Why have they caused such anger? Why have the people rejected that?
The main thing people are saying in the streets is that we don't trust you, we don't trust anything you do as a political class, and we don't want you ruling our country. I mean, this is because, this is something you see on the ground, you see on TV with Vox Pops, etc. But also, like, the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies did a study and published about the demands of protesters, and 2/3 are talking about political change and accountability. It's basically everyone saying, you are not trusted as politicians, as the ruling class of the country. We want other people to be in government, people that represent our interests and that can take change forward. But also, the economic reform plan, or so it's called, by the Prime Minister was really a joke. I mean, no one who knows basic economics can believe that this plan can save the country in any way. It's reducing, it's continuing on the same kind of economic paradigm that, you know, when we have a crisis, we reduce public spending to an extent. We do certain measures that kind of save us for this year, and then next year we'll have the same problems. For example, it says it will reduce the deficit in the budget to 0%. That's like a $6 billion reduction in a country where, you know, the GDP is 50 billion. And also this reduction is based on a lie, which is that they will pump money into the government for 1 year. And then the next year we'll have the same kind of deficit. We'll borrow more money. We'll be paying all this money to the banks and other people who have lent the state. And we'll be in the same economic cycle. It's a vicious cycle, and they're just reinforcing it. On the other hand, they cut spending in places that can have economic impacts, positive economic impacts in the future, which are infrastructural investment, capital investments, because they're relying on money that hasn't come yet, but might come from outside through the so-called Sadr conference, where Lebanon basically asked international organizations and foreign countries to give loans to support infrastructure projects. But in general, it's the same economic paradigm that has caused us the misery that we're in today. It's been implemented for 30 years. It has failed, and it will not succeed this time.
So Hicham, clearly a lot of anger directed at the government and political leaders being blamed for leading the country into this economic crisis. And there's no doubt that Lebanon has a massive public debt.
Yes, let me build up on what Nizar has said. The first point is that Lebanon, since the 1990s, has been building up its debt by borrowing both from local banks and from international lenders, but mostly from local banks. Over time, these funds were not used to actually invigorate the economy. They were used mostly to actually distribute wealth across the ruling class based on certain sectarian divisions of spoils. And eventually, the large expenditure became servicing this very debt. So part of the crisis we're seeing today is due to this debt, which is now around 150% of GDP. Now, what the government has tried to do with the drying up of resources that usually tend to finance Lebanon's poor economy, such as remittances or tourism, which are dying out, is to seek international support.
Right.
In return for this international support, they were expected to implement so-called austerity measures. This is something that Lebanon shares with other countries around the world, like Chile or other countries. So what we're facing in Lebanon is an attempt to further squeeze out the middle class and the working class from the little earnings they make, and to invest that money in debt. If there's going to be a refinancing of the debt, the so-called international community is asking Lebanon to implement some of these measures of reduction in investment in social services, cutting out of subsidies of the electricity company, and rather focusing on servicing the debt. So the economic crisis blew out as a result of this accumulation of reduction in social and in regular government services.
So that is the scene set for us, and as is usual, when an economic picture is this bad, people blame the government. They want the government to leave them out of it. The problem with changing the government in Lebanon is that people are asking for a change in the political system. And how difficult is that going to be in a country like Lebanon, which has relied on the same political system since the end of the civil war in 1990?
I mean, if we're talking about the system of political sectarianism, it has also depended on the acquiescence of the general public to that system, right? And I think what we're really seeing right now is a rupturing of the kind of dominance of this idea that Lebanon needs political sectarianism in order to survive. It is obviously not a system that can enable economic or social justice, right? So, you know, there's this narrative that on the one hand, you know, this is a country built based on sort of conflicting communities and they need to be managed by their kind of sectarian representatives. And the other side of the other way that that narrative has survived is through patronage or clientelism. So the ability of kind of sectarian leaders to be able to buy votes or to kind of take care of their constituents in order that they keep supporting them, right? On the one hand, sectarian bosses are no longer able to kind of maintain this sort of economy of clientelism. And on the other hand, I think, again, what we're seeing now is the rupturing of this idea that you need this system in order to protect the country, right? People are not just recognizing, but I think acting upon the realization that it is the sectarian ruling class that is causing socioeconomic injustice, and that what is needed is a sort of class-based alliance against the ruling class.
So people see this as a ruling elite who are no longer serving their needs.
Yes.
Why were they not appeased by the resignation of Saad Hariri?
Well, I think to kind of build off of what Nizar said, I think, I mean, well, to begin with, the government in Lebanon also resigns all the time. It's not necessarily something that implies that anything substantial is going to be done before. People are aware that what needs to happen is a political, social, economic restructuring, right? So a resignation, while it's a victory for the streets in the sense that they were able to force this, it's definitely not enough, and people recognize that the revolution needs to continue and this work needs to be built on.
Right. Well, let me get the picture from Beirut. Ghinwa, people initially celebrated the resignation of Saad Hariri, but now they're asking for a lot more. Now a lot of people want to see a government of technocrats, a completely independent government of experts. Why have they moved to that position of thinking?
I mean, I think it was the protesters' demand from the beginning. I think the confusion happened is that it was believed that what the protesters wanted was only the resignation of Prime Minister Saad Hariri, but that's not it. I think protesters from the beginning, they've been calling for a technocrat government that can act maybe in this phase until maybe we can figure out what's going to happen next. So one of the main things that the protesters kind of, if you want, underscored after Hariri resigned is that we're not going to stop here. No, on the contrary, we want the parliament speakers as well to resign, as well as the president to resign, and to form a technocrat government. So it's not a new demand. It has been there since the beginning.
I suppose the question is it possible? Nizar, maybe I could get your view on this, on whether this idea of an independent government, is that possible in Lebanon, given the sensitivity over the existing power structure?
Yeah, that's a bit tricky. There are many opinions within the same groups and parties about this. I think it's possible to have a technocratic government for sure. It has happened many times in the history of Lebanon, and it will happen in the future. It's a normal thing in a country like Lebanon, where politics is not really about policies. It's about basically the power sharing and the resources sharing struggle that Hicham was talking about. I think it's possible because it's a way out for many of the parties to be kind of getting rid of the responsibility for the upcoming period, which is, in my opinion, harsher than what we've seen already in terms of socioeconomic deterioration and the possible economic collapse or collapse in the financial system. So it's smart for even Hariri to say, I'm not going to be prime minister. It's smart for Hezbollah and Bassil and everyone to say, I'm not going to be part of this government and let it be an independent government. And then maybe come back a year later and say, look what happened when we are not in power and when people's representation or the parties that people voted for are not there. This is what happens, etc. And they come back as a counter-revolution with a sense of, restoring the order, etc. I'm not sure. Like, they are not in harmony with each other. They are not making decisions in a way that we can talk about, a ruling class conspiracy. But I think in general, it's smart for them to do it. And it's clear that this is what the streets want from the first day, as Ghinwa was saying. It was not a demand that came after Hariri's resignation. From the first week, all groups almost had the same demand: resignation of the government, formation of the new government with a specific mandate. First of all, it should be independent from the political forces, and it should have the prerogatives to work on two main things: an early parliamentary elections, because as I was saying, this is a matter of political representation and political change. And then the other thing is accountability and holding those that caused, the very wide corruption that everyone knows of in Lebanon, to be held accountable for their actions. So these are kind of the two things that people want the new government to do. And people know that if the parties are represented in government, and according to what we've seen from these parties in the last 30 years, this is impossible to achieve.
Okay, so I mean, this is what Michel Aoun, the president, is trying to achieve. Hicham, do you think there can be a technocratic government? And I suppose the million-dollar question is, can a technocratic government lead Lebanon out of its problems?
Well, first, let me say, I don't think that everybody wants a technocratic government. I think this is a particular demand that is most visibly articulated by a group of what could be called liberal reformist current within the protests. And they've been demanding a technocratic government to reform, to end corruption, to basically implement some of the mitigating effects of what's happening. So the technocratic government, Hariri himself, the father, was a businessman and technocrat. You can be a good technocrat, you can be a bad technocrat, you can be a neoliberal technocrat, you can be somebody who believes in a certain economic plan. So
and technocratic governments aren't meant to be permanent, are they?
No, I think that there is a point to be made that people are wanting people with a clean slate who are seen as non-corrupt to take over the management of government. There is a sentiment that we want, again, a new class of people who are not tied to the interests of this class, whom we can trust. But the demand for technocratic government is not necessarily everybody's demand. Now,
it's certainly not Hezbollah's demand, is it?
Well, can I go back to the idea of, before we jump into that? But I do think part of the problem with the demand for a technocratic government is also this language of somebody with a clean slate, right? Somebody who isn't corrupt. The assumption being that what we've been suffering from is bad governance, when yes, we do have bad governance, but we also have been suffering from decades of neoliberal policies that have really damaged the livability of the majority of the population.
But corruption
right?
is a massive issue for many Lebanese who say that the government and political leaders and the powerful are corrupt.
Definitely, and there are issues of embezzlement and so on and so forth. But I think that also sometimes when we are talking about corruption, we are also talking about neoliberalism, which enables certain forms of corruption in ways that other sort of governmental economic systems don't. And yeah, again, on this idea of technocrats, Rafi al-Hariri was committed to having a technocratic government, which was part of how we ended up with the post-war development, neoliberalization of the economy that has, played a significant role in where we've ended up, right? So when we use the word technocrat, we don't necessarily know what that particular person, beyond sort of not having been entangled in governance in the country at the moment, what kind of economic policies they actually represent or stand for. To me, that's the big question if you're going to talk about elections. Also, a lot of people think that the idea of focusing on resignations and on elections and on the parliament shouldn't be the kind of main focus right now. So there are people that are calling for sort of more grassroots, the reconstitution, rebuilding of unions, which were largely co-opted in the post-war period or decimated. And so really creating spaces where professionals, NGO workers, what have you, can kind of organize for their economic demands and collectively sort of defend them and call for them. So there are these other kind of approaches to both the ongoing revolutionary period and what should come after.
Okay, so just going...
Can I make a comment here?
Sorry, go on, Nizar.
Okay, I totally agree with what Hicham and Sophie were saying. I did not say, I said, I was answering the question whether a technocratic government can be formed and might be formed rather than whether this is what we want or not. Because a technocrat, as Hicham said, can be someone like Fuad Sanyura, who is known to be one of the people responsible for the financial chaos that exists in the States and other policies that are very detrimental. I'm not saying technocrat is the answer.
So I suppose my question is a technocratic government seen as the way to lead Lebanon out of its economic problems right now, as opposed to, well, what do we see for the political system in the long term? So let's stick with the short term for this question. Is a technocratic government, is that what people believe is necessary to solve Lebanon's immediate economic crisis?
Okay, in my opinion, there's a lot of opinions about this. Obviously, in the streets, people don't want the same things. Like Sophie was saying, different people have different approaches to organizing, but these things don't really contradict each other. Like the issue of political representation and the issue of workers involving reviving unions and students reviving unions is happening like at the same time simultaneously. But what you're hitting on is exactly the right nail, in my opinion. What we need now is not to say we need a government of technocrats. This is quite self-evident, to be honest. It might happen, not, but it's an easy demand. What we need to have is demands for specific economic policies that will make people who have benefited from this bad economic system that we've had in the last 30 years pay the price for the crisis that they have caused. And I'm talking about not only the politicians, but also the ruling class in general, which includes the bankers and the real estate speculators and whoever is part of this, and people who occupy maritime properties. So what we need is economic policies that are very bold, and these economic policies cannot be achieved, will not be enacted by people like Hariri or the FPM or any of the ruling parties, because they have very, very strong connections, and even them as politicians are often involved in companies in these sectors. So they will not increase the tax on the banks, they will not reschedule the debt, they will not do a haircut policy, they will not do any of these things unless they are forced to by a very well organized popular movement, in my opinion, or through political change in the future.
I think to add or to rediscuss this point is that, first of all, there are different scenarios that can happen. One of the things that could happen in terms of the constitutional process, which was mentioned briefly, is for there to be a government formed and then to have elections come up, which would elect a new parliament, which then possibly elect a new president. So that's a well-known constitutional process that can regenerate. But this process is very likely to reproduce, in the absence of organized alternatives, the same ruling class that exists. That's what I was going to ask. So that's the first caveat about going that route. The second point I want to make, to rebuild on what has been discussed, is what balance of power exists today between the government and the people protesting. That's an important question. In my opinion, we are at a stage where the protesters and the uprising is strong enough to cause confusion and concessions by the ruling class, but not strong enough to force it to radically change the political system. So this is the stage. This is why there's partially a deadlock. This is why focusing, in my opinion, on economic policy, not on people, is important. So as long as people can push this class to concede further and further until we reach a point where potentially there is an alternative. But if we insist on simply replacing those in power with others, that can potentially co-opt the movement. It can create division among the movement in terms of who will get to represent the movement in this government. And also, there's the question of vacuum, which,
let me ask Ghinwa that question. Is there enough momentum in the protests to perhaps force a change in the political system, or is there a risk of political deadlock in Lebanon?
I mean, one thing I can tell you for sure is that people, or if you want the protesters, as I told you before, is that they made their demands very clear. And to repeat what has been said is that there's definitely an issue of lack of trust. So now everything that you're gonna put before the protesters, they're just gonna, they're gonna doubt it because of this lack of trust and the empty promises that have been made over, not just over the past couple of, 2-3 years, but over the course of, say, 10 years at least. So I think that, yes, there is momentum in order to push for what they actually want, and it also depends on how the political class is gonna, play this game. Because now I think that the ball is in the political class's court. So it depends on the approach and how they're gonna deal with this. It's either, I think it's either a break or make for them.
A make or break moment. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this issue, but we have come to the end of the show. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and thank you to all my guests. And don't forget, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for TRT World Roundtable. For now, from me and all my guests, bye-bye.